welcome, and thank you so much for sharing a little bit of time with me today. It's so nice to see a lot of very wonderful friends in the audience. I think Bakwaya from Endeavor is over here. Can you raise your hand? There you go. Many, many others here. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to talk about a couple of things today, to share a few things that have been on my mind and that I've been learning these last few years. But before we do that, I want to start with a really fun game, because it's the first thing in the morning. Let's get warmed up. I think a lot of you have heard about something called IQ, how smart people are, or EQ, how good people are at relationships. But my favorite Q is actually something different. It's AQ. And some of you may see me play this game before, but I want to find out who in this room has the highest AQ of everybody here. So you ready to begin? If you've been to the city I'm about to show you, I want you to raise your hand. And I want you to keep track of how many times you've raised your hand. I'm going to show you the 25 biggest cities in Southeast Asia, the cities that are powering the next 20 years of Southeast Asia's growth. So let's get started. Who's been here? Raise your hand if you've been here. Okay, a few people have been there. Who's been here? Okay, if you have not raised your hand, you can please leave the room now. Who has been to Bangkok? Now keep track. You have to keep the number of how many times you've raised your hands. Who's been to Ho Chi Minh? Oh, very good. The next one, Kuala Lumpur. Okay, very good. Singapore? Big number. Yangon? Oh, not as many people. Interesting. Hanoi? Okay, good number. Bekasi? Wow, I'm in the right audience for this question. I don't get this many hands in Bangkok. Surabaya? Okay. Depok? Good. Wow, this is a good audience. Bandung? Good. Some ITB grads in the audience. Tangerang? Chonburi? Oh, a few people. Okay, good. Medan? Very good. Phnom Penh? Oh, okay, good. This first row has traveled a lot around the region. Semarang? Yeah, good. Davao? Samut Prakan? Now, by the way, did I mention there's a prize for whoever has the biggest number of hands, but you don't let that change your answers. Samut Prakan. Palembang? Okay, good. Kanto? Not that many. Makassar? All right, good. Batam? Mandalay? Haiphong? Okay, so who has been to 10 of these cities? Raise your, at least 10, at least 10. Okay, pretty good. Who's been to 11? 12? 13? Wow. 14? 15? Okay. Who's been to 16? 17? 18? 19? 20? 21? It doesn't go past 25. 22, 23, 24. This is the first time ever I've had a 25. Congratulations. Wow, I've never had a 25. That's really impressive. Really impressive. But it goes to show Southeast Asia is so enormous and wide, and the more we know about Southeast Asia, the better we'll be able to build businesses in Southeast Asia. So today I'm going to very briefly talk about 4 key topics. The first is why Southeast Asia, and more importantly, why now Southeast Asia? Where will the next $20 billion businesses likely be in Southeast Asia? Should we be building regional companies, or should we be focusing on any one particular country? And finally, I want to talk about one of my favorite countries in the world, Indonesia. This is my 45th trip to Indonesia in the last 8 years. I love this country, and I want to share a few observations that Pakwaya and I have been thinking about from an endeavor and from an entrepreneurial ecosystem perspective. So let's jump in. I'm going to go pretty quickly. Southeast Asia itself is a very special region. It has 9% of the world's population. It has almost 13 or 14% of the world's young population. It's an extraordinarily interesting part of the world, but I would say for the last 20 years, it has been underappreciated. It has been neglected. And interestingly enough, part of the reason is that China has been so compelling and so exciting. And before China, it was Korea and Japan, and before Korea and Japan, it was America. And you see it in the data. If you look at the per capita affluence, the per capita living standards of different parts of the world, you see a very consistent pattern where different countries have grown, others follow in their footsteps and in their inspiration. Southeast Asia right now is right between China and right between India. But the really interesting thing isn't just that it's a little bit less affluent than China and a little bit more affluent than India. The really interesting thing is that Southeast Asia is in a zone of income that we like to call a golden age, a unicorn zone. And the reason that is so important is that at this zone, spendable income for families, discretionary income, goes from 5% to 15%. And that we've designed this chart to be a doubling chart at every stage of the ladder. So when you double your income and you go from 5% to 15%, you're 6xing, you're sextupling spendable income, and that creates the opportunity for really big companies. It is hard to build an enormous company in India today, even though there are 1.3 billion people, because on average, each of them only earns $2,000 a year, and only $100 of that is discretionary. In Southeast Asia, we earn about $4,500 a year, and about 15% of that is discretionary. Now, it isn't just Southeast Asia's phenomenon that we're seeing the Seas, the Grabs, the Gojeks, and many, many others. It turns out that when China was in that zone, it was 2003 to 2013, and that was a true golden age for China. And the vast majority of today's value of tech companies in China went public in or around that zone. Turns out the same exact thing happened in Korea a generation earlier when our parents were growing up. And the same exact thing happened in Japan when our grandparents were growing up. This is so powerful, and this is a proven theme for East Asian countries, that as we reach a very special band of affluence, magical things happen for forming companies. This is the entrepreneur's golden age. Now, what do we do now that we're in the golden age? Well, the first thing is we should build some really big companies. And what we've seen all around the world is that unicorns tend to come in waves. But when you get to about 10 or 11 unicorns, that's a tipping point. That's a moment when things get really exciting. And we are very much already at, if not even past, that stage right now. The question is, who will those next 20 unicorns be here in Southeast Asia? To answer that question, let me share something with you that we call the bonsai tree. And it always pains us and makes us sad when we see entrepreneurs going down directions that might work in a different country, but probably won't work as well in Southeast Asia. In a simple nutshell, every successful tech company in the world falls into one of three basic buckets. 70% of the global market cap of tech is bucket one. That's Apple and Facebook and Amazon and Google. You know it's bucket one, a global winner, when the Google of Indonesia is Google and the Facebook of Thailand is Facebook. And in many ways, we can learn from these businesses and use them, but they tend, in many cases, to be global. And we should aspire to have some of these in Southeast Asia. But statistically speaking, the whole world tries to compete for this. There's a second category where the politicians put in laws that block foreign competition. We don't have very much of that over here. The most important area is what we call category 3, where there's actually, just like in tennis or in rugby or football, there's a home court advantage. There's something structural about being a local company in those business models, and there's great examples all around us. Here in Indonesia, you see Gojek and Tokopedia. More broadly, you see Sea and Grab and Lazada. And we've tried to think about what is it that makes those companies so successful versus international big bad competition. Well, it turns out they're category 3s. And category 3s have something very special in common. They prosper in a local region, and they almost always have less money than their international competition, but they win. It's like David versus Goliath. It's the minnow versus the whale. And why do they win? They win because they're local. They understand the consumer. They master the supply chain. They understand cross-border interactions. And over 20 years, about every 18 months, a wonderful new model presents itself, sometimes discovered outside of Southeast Asia, in fact, often discovered outside of Southeast Asia, but that model gets emulated and won by a local player here. And we encourage all of you in the room to think about what might be those next categories that we should win. Here's a hint. We're exactly 11 years behind China. China has had a wonderful 25-year run that, as you saw on the previous page, has built $2.5 trillion of equity value. $2.5 trillion is 2.5 Microsofts. It's extraordinary how successful they've been. And they did it in 4 basic steps. They laid the table with telecommunications. They had a first generation of web companies, a second generation that were a little bit more specialized, and then a third generation of very mobile-oriented companies that were also very offline-enabled. And don't just think of this as kind of a pretty consultant chart. This is actually exactly what happened. This is every IPO in tech in China for the last 25 years. And it exactly went through telecommunications, then first gen, then second gen, and then O2O off in the corner. In fact, by the time they got to the upper right corner, they were already leapfrogging Japan, America, and Europe, to say nothing of the rest of the world. This is a playbook. This is a recipe book, because back to our bonsai tree, with the exception of Baidu and some of the telcos, a lot of these companies had foreign capital and were open to foreign investment, but they were local winners. They were category threes. So we ask a very simple question, and we want you to ask a very simple question: which of these haven't been done yet in Southeast Asia? Turns out the answer is very straightforward. These are the ones we've already done so far. These are all the companies that match that periodic table of the elements of China and have already gone public in Southeast Asia. In fact, we're exactly 10 years behind. Not in terms of being hopelessly behind. In some ways, we have a 10-year time machine to learn from. And if you think about what's missing on this page, well, it's all of these rows. In fact, sometimes even in a row that already has a public company, you can still see innovation and development, just like China did. And when we say that there's going to be 20 more unicorns in Southeast Asia, this is what we're talking about. This is the playbook for creating 20 more billion-dollar companies. And it's going to happen in the next 10 years, not just because China did it, but because we're at that zone of affluence when there's just so much spending, businesses have so much momentum that'll help them grow over the next decade. So this is really the moment to strike while the iron is hot. Now, it raises an interesting question as well. Should you build these businesses in one country or in two countries or in all the countries? And it's a question that gets asked a lot in Indonesia, because Indonesia is just so big. It's the fourth largest country in the world. Let me share a personal point of view on this. One of the things that people often don't realize, especially people outside of Southeast Asia, they look at the map and they see 7 or 8 countries, 10 member states in ASEAN, lots of languages and government regulations, and they say, oh my God, this is really complicated. But we know something on the ground that they don't know. Take a look at this. These are the 10 most popular international flight routes on the planet. It includes London to Germany, Moscow to Tel Aviv, whatever, everything in the world. Turns out 4 of the 10 most frequent flights on the planet are inside of Southeast Asia. Look at Jakarta, has 2 of the top 5 on the planet. Our region is coming back together after many, many years apart during the years of colonialization and post-colonialization. I'll show you something else. Our region has gone through 20 years now of entrepreneurship. People like you in this room and our forebears who were building tech companies over the last 20 years. And yeah, look, in the first few years, it was really tough. Most people were single country or double country. Then in the second period of time, kind of before and after the global financial crisis, people tried a lot of things. There were some great companies that were just Indonesia. A few of us at Sea and at Agoda tried to build regional businesses. Some people even went global. But look what a difference 20 years makes. Today, almost everybody is trying to build a regional business in Southeast Asia. That's really interesting. Now, how did that happen? Well, part of it is people recognize that Southeast Asia's complexity could actually be part of our home court advantage. Because if something is complicated, at least we can understand it and navigate it. It's pretty hard for people coming from out of town to navigate it. And what you see when you see the map of Southeast Asia as a chessboard is that you've got 6 major economies, and all of them have a different gift that they've been given. For example, Indonesia and Thailand, well, they've got the GDP. 4 of the countries have the population. 2 of them have the programmers. Sadly, not Indonesia and Thailand in terms of the number of programmers that are available. Only 1 of the countries has managed to build a global connectivity for capital markets, and 2 of the countries have produced many, many companies that have spread across the region. So lesson number 1 is that you can go regional, but you take advantage of all of these different gifts. And it turns out that there's basically 2 ways to do it. We call it, very simplistically, strategy 1 and strategy 2. Strategy 1 is just win Indonesia. Tokopedia comes to mind, OVO comes to mind, Gojek in its first few years comes to mind, Bukalapak, and many, many other great companies. And that's a perfectly good strategy. Strategy 2 is you take advantage of all the different regional strengths, and you often will build your company in Singapore, and you spread and broaden across the entire region. That's a very good strategy also. And as a purely mathematical fact, if you look at all the deals that the early stage VCs do, the checks that are kind of A and B rounds, $1 million up to a $20 million round, turns out 20% of them are going after strategy 1, Indonesia for Indonesia's sake. And 50% of them are going after strategy 2. And the market has sort of spoken that strategies 3, 4, 5, and 6 that are anchored around other countries or other combinations are getting somewhat less attention, and we think that's probably right in terms of the historical strengths and weaknesses of the entire region. But Indonesia has 2 very vital roles to play. Even if you're strategy 2, Indonesia becomes your most important country, and it might even be your headquarters as it is for Traveloka. But if you do strategy 1, you'll still be based here as it is. And interestingly enough, the way in which you do strategy 1 and 2 has also evolved. Strategy 1 has always been very straightforward. Stay in Indonesia, hire a local team, do a good job across all 17,000 islands. Strategy 2 historically was harder because you had to find a team at the co-founder or C-level or C-level -1 group that really represented Southeast Asia. And it's a very interesting observation that most of the companies that did strategy 2 in the last generation of unicorns, they actually went abroad to study. And they came back home with friends from Thailand and Singapore and Indonesia and Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia. And that helped them put these companies together. And interestingly, sir, is everything okay? Hi. Interestingly enough, if you think about the current generation of companies, they have a phenomenal advantage that these companies didn't have. And I'll jump ahead and show it to you. They are being founded by alumni, graduates of companies that themselves were already regional. Look at the 12 companies over here. We call them the 12 institutions, the 12 academies. They have produced 20,000 graduates that are now running around Southeast Asia, and 10% of those, 2,000, have founded companies. How great is that? And unlike the previous generation where you had to meet a whole bunch of people through a university setting, or maybe your family network, or maybe you worked at McKinsey and you met people in different regions, today you pull together your friends who work with you at Grab, or maybe a friend at Gojek and a friend at Traveloka, or whatever it is, and you can build a great company because the human capital that understands strategy 2 is significantly better than before, which is an enormous advantage that we didn't have 10 years ago. Finally, I want to just share a couple of ideas about Indonesia specifically. We have about 10, 12 minutes left, so I'll maybe just slow down the pace a little bit to really delve into some of these topics. I have such love for Indonesia, and I want the country to prosper, and I would just point out 3 or 4 things that we can all work on collectively. And Pak Waya and I are applying our personal lives to this. He is the head of Endeavor Indonesia, me on the board, but many others are joining the cause to help Indonesia march in a very special direction. So what are a couple of things that matter that we can do better to build more great companies out of Indonesia specifically? Well, let me start with one important point that used to get a lot of attention in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and today it doesn't quite get enough attention, which is the quality and the cost of technology infrastructure. Let me show something very granular and very data-driven to you. What you're looking at over here, again on a log chart, is the long story of how different parts of the world adopt mobile. Look how amazing this is. So Indonesia is already probably the 3rd or 4th largest pool of mobile users on the planet, behind, of course, South Asia, China, and North America. In fact, by now, Indonesia is probably bigger than North America. But this is mobile users, including just voice. Look at the next page and you see a somewhat more mixed picture. This is the number of the population, the percent of the population that uses the internet. Now, it looks very positive. Indonesia's growing up and to the right, but you'll notice that Indonesia is a few steps behind Southeast Asia as a whole. And more interestingly, because Indonesia is about 20 years ahead of India in terms of its affluence per capita, Indonesia is actually a little bit behind India. Used to be way ahead, and in the last few years has kind of fallen behind. Let's just park that thought. Interestingly, the population penetration of internet, as exciting as it is for all of the startups here, it could be better. And we should all be figuring out ways to improve this ratio. And a very simple way to think about it is this. Looks like a lot of numbers. Let me decode it for you. The left-hand side of the page is mobile phones. The right-hand side of the page is broadband in a home or in an office. What we find everywhere in the world is that as countries get richer, the speed of internet gets better. That's not a surprise. Japan and Korea are amazing. Places in Africa, not quite as much so. But when you look at the pattern, what's interesting to see is who's doing better than trend and who's maybe doing a little bit less than trend. The comparison I want to draw over here is to the Philippines. You'll see the Philippines and Indonesia kind of side by side, two sister countries separated just by a little bit of water, wonderful cultural heritage and similarities. But look at how the Philippines is a little bit less affluent than we are here, but their speeds are higher. Now, to be clear, their expense is also very expensive. Internet in the Philippines is very expensive. But I think it's interesting to look at Vietnam. Vietnam actually has faster internet speeds, both on mobile and on broadband, than we do. Yet they're actually a much less affluent country, much closer to India in affluence. So again, something for us all to think about, and I think it's not entirely right for entrepreneurs to think of this as somebody else's problem. We should all be collectively figuring out solutions and strategies to have Indonesia go to the trend line and even a bit higher above to help everybody in the ecosystem. The second thing I want to talk about goes back to education, and maybe a little bit goes back to this concept of regional companies versus domestic companies, but also just human capital in general. One of the most interesting things about the last few years is that a rising number of Indonesians are studying in other Southeast Asian countries. It's a pretty cool trend. And sorry, the chart's a bit bungled up, but what you'll see is that one over there in the corner is Thailand. So Indonesians who go to Malaysia, Malaysians who come to Indonesia, Vietnamese who go to Indonesia, and again, Indonesians who go to Thailand. Growing very quickly really helps Indonesian founders to do what Traveloka did, get around the entire region. It's crucial to have these people. There's a couple other matches that haven't quite gone in the right direction, opportunity for maybe rethinking, maybe encouraging people to do this. We should bring more Thais here to Jakarta. We should be sending more of our kids to the Philippines. But in general, a pretty positive story. Where I think that actually we have an opportunity to take advantage of some amazing low-hanging fruit is the following. What you see on the left-hand side of the page is how many kids from different countries in Asia go to the United States to get an undergraduate degree. I just picked the US partly because I'm from there, but also the data is really easy to get. You could have picked London or Japan or, for that matter, Australia, but let's just look at the US for a second. Look at how amazing China has been. China has dramatically upskilled their workforce with a little bit of government help by sending 11 times as many kids to America over the past 20-odd years. Pretty amazing. Indonesia's actually sort of gone in a different direction. And if you think about on a per capita basis, again, very impressive to see what Vietnam is doing and China's doing. What's so special about this chart from Indonesia's perspective is that it's a low-hanging fruit. With the trade war and the military tensions between China and America, a lot of people who used to go to America from China, those seats are now empty. Indonesians can take advantage of them and get engineering degrees and very specialized professional degrees and bring those skills back home, which is wonderful for this country. Turns out the exact same thing is happening at the graduate school level. Again, China has dramatically increased the number of PhD kids and master's kids it sends to America. Indonesia is unfortunately maybe not taking full advantage of that opportunity. And again, it's a clear path forward and a low-hanging fruit. I want to emphasize something very powerful. It turns out that when you do this and you send your kids abroad and you upskill them, it isn't just good for those American universities, it's good for the home country. This is fascinating. If you look at the left-hand side, there's a very clear correlation between how quickly you grow the number of kids you send for American education and how quickly your country grows. Now, you could argue the arrow goes in both directions. One causes the other and the other causes the one. But still, this is so powerful, and it shows you how China has gotten so much benefit from upskilling its labor force, largely because of American capacity in a very meaningful way. The last two topics I want to talk about are capital, which is such an important topic. Every CEO that I meet tells me that at least half of his time is spent on the road fundraising. Let's talk a little bit about that. And one of the really interesting things that we're seeing right now, October, November 2019, is this. Think of this as kind of the ecosystem for funding. At the seed stage, which we would just define as up to $1 million of capital, there's about 200 plus participants. Now, calling them firms might be an exaggeration because many of them are just family offices, one-off individuals, but there's wonderful organizations like Antler and Surge and many, many others, Seed Plus, that are doing great work over there. There's a lot of chances for all of you in this room to get that seed check. There used to be a real gap in the A and the B. $1 million up to $20 million rounds. Today, very happily, again for everybody in this room, we estimate between 25 and 26 firms that do that for a living. And that really happened in just the last 3 or 4 years. The problem for most companies we bump into is that when they're ready to raise 25 or 30 or 40 million dollars, it's really hard. In fact, there's an old joke that it's easier to raise 400 million or 4 million in Southeast Asia than it is to raise 40. But that shouldn't make a lot of sense, but that in fact is the case. There's a lack of supply. And I want to talk about that specifically in the Indonesian context. So bear with me and just keep in mind that $20 to $100 million category, which is very much a gap in the market. But let me prove it to you. So if you think about how frequently do deals like that happen in different parts of the world, again, $20 million to $100 million rounds, what we would call a C or a D in Southeast Asia. In America, they do 2.3 of those for every million citizens of the country every year. So about 330 citizens, 2.3. They're doing 700 of those deals every single year. China is doing about 0.1 per million citizens. So about 1.3 billion people, about 130 of those every year. All of Southeast Asia is 0.018. And Indonesia by itself is 0.0039 per million people. It is 600 times harder to raise a Series C and D in Indonesia than it is in America. That doesn't make any sense to me, but that is the state of affairs we have right now. In dollar terms, America puts 0.12% of its GDP into those deals every year. We're putting 0.005% of our GDP into that every single year. I think it's a mistake, but also I think it's a huge opportunity for us to fill this gap to help the entrepreneurs of this region. In fact, if you measure the conversion, so you raise your seed, then you get your A and your B round. Let's say you've raised an A or a B round. How easy is it to raise a C or a D round conversion in the next 3 years? Well, in China, 35% convert. In all of Southeast Asia, 24% convert. But here in Indonesia, in Nusantara, only 12% convert. And that turns out to be not because of a lack of amazing, talented people like the people in this room. It's a lack of supply. And let me show it to you in visual terms. This is kind of a fun chart, a bit of a geeky chart for the engineers in the room. This is every single tech deal done in China last 4 or 5 years, every single tech deal done in Southeast Asia last 4 or 5 years, from the biggest deal to the smallest deal. And to sort of detangle or untangle this chart, if the two lines are on top of each other, it means the ecosystems are of equal strength. So above $100 million check, China and ASEAN, they're about the same. Once you're ready to raise $125 million, no handicap being in ASEAN. But man, look at this gap over here in the bottom. That's that series A, B, C, D, but really C, D gap in Southeast Asia. And here's the bad news. It's actually harder and even worse in Indonesia. The chart is even more skewed in Indonesia, where once you're big, it's pretty easy to raise the capital. It's actually easier to raise the capital in Indonesia at the $150, $500 million level than in China. But again, kind of in that sub-100 level, that's the gap that I'm talking about that we all collectively have to find a way to fix. It turns out that it's a gap not just in terms of dollars, but also a really interesting gap in terms of how investors think about Indonesia. I want to show something very interesting to you. Investors think about how much reward they're getting for the risk they take. That sounds pretty straightforward and common sense. There's a measure of that called the Sharpe ratio, which is literally how much gain do you get for how much risk you're taking. The bigger that ratio, the better it is. Turns out that Indonesian commercial real estate, which is a big category of asset investment in Indonesia, has identical Sharpe ratios to technology in Southeast Asia. Yet commercial real estate, just look around us, gets so much more capital than technology. So we think it's interesting not just in terms of the need of the economy, but actually it's in the investors' interest to want to help all of you, because they'd be as well off doing your investments as they would in building another mall or another condominium in Indonesia. I'll leave with one final thought, and maybe an aspirational thought, which I think is good news, but will take some hard work for all of us collectively to work on. And I'm not just the critic here, I'm stepping in to help fix some of these problems. It's a very interesting fact that in the 1990s, when all of us were growing up, Indonesia was a very active user of the US capital markets. I want to show you something here. From 1990 to 2000, Indonesian firms raised about $9 billion in capital markets, IPOs and secondaries, and a quarter of that came from the US. In fact, even more money came from the US for Indonesian companies than it did for Chinese companies, which is pretty interesting. But look what happened in the 2000s. Ever since 2001 to the present day, there hasn't been a single Indonesian IPO in America. There's no legal reason for that. There's no structural reason. Indonesia remains the fourth most important country on the planet and probably one of the top two in terms of growth and importance. Yet the Chinese have continued to tap into the American markets and we haven't. Let me look at just tech for a second. This is all industries. In the tech landscape, even better, in the 1990s, our tech companies, which were largely telecommunications back then, but there were some other ones, 55% of the capital they raised in public offerings came from the American stock market. They listed in America. But in the 2000s, none of them did. And this surprises me. It surprises Pak Waya. It surprises many of us because there's no good reason for this to happen. The American markets love Indonesia. They're so excited by Indonesia. They want to be investors in your companies. So I have a simple suggestion and maybe an offer of help. One company has done this, which is our company, C, that I used to work at. And the pleasure of ringing that bell and the knowledge from ringing that bell is something that we want to share with you. This is why I retired from C. I retired to a large extent so that I could be a mentor and a supporter, either as an investor or just pro bono, to all the people in this room. It's at the stage of life I'm at, and I want to be a good resource to all of you. So my suggestion to you is call any of us. There's 5 of us and another wonderful colleague that founded our firm. Our job is to mentor and help and support the next generation, and we want each of you in this room to have a chance to ring that bell, and more substantively, to have a chance to get that capital. Because that capital is inexpensive, it's high quality, and it gives you stability for your businesses. Let's take full advantage of that together in the next 10 or 15 years. Thank you very much.
Stop us, no one can stop us.